Takže dobrý večer. Dúfam, že to funguje. Chcel by som dneska privítať na našej prednáške Kristien Ring, ktorá je vlastne súčasťou doprovodného programu našej výstavy Baugruppe i Zupa, ktorú si potom môžete prehľadnúť vedľa. Ešte chcel by som predtým, než začneme celú prednášku, pripomenúť, že máme každú nedeľu komentované prehliadky, kde sa môžete stretnúť s kurátormi a autormi výstavy. Tých môžem zároveň hneď teraz predstaviť. Marek Kopeč, Helena Doudová ako kurátori výstavy. Ja som Vlado Fialka z Inštitútu plánovania rozvoja a moja kolegyňa Žofia Rajmanová. Tam uteká Ondrej Dušek a Jana Doudová je, myslím, že tu nie je. Tá je v Berlíne, odkiaľ tá celá výstava prišla sem. Tak a teraz by som vám už rád predstavil Kristien Ring. Dneska tu bude mať prednášku o svojej práci. Kristien Ring je architektka, kurátorka a vlastne riaditeľka AA Projects. Zaoberá sa vlastne multidisciplinárnymi projektmi orientovanými na architektúru a urbanizmus. Vydala najznámejšia knižka asi u nás je od nej Self-Made City, Berlin Self-Initiated Urban Living and Architectural Interventions. A teraz najnovšia knižka v roku 2015 Urban Living Strategies for the Future. V súčasnosti je profesorka na University of Sheffield a asistujúcim profesorom na Technickej univerzite v Braunschweigu. Je tiež zakladateľka nemeckého centra pre architektúru DAS, možno niektorí poznáte, robia super veci a je tiež spoluzakladateľkou galérie Suitcase Architecture. Pochádza z Pittsburghu, z USA a je v Berlíne od roku 1991, takže videla celú premenu Berlína. A prednáška bude v angličtine, takže dúfam, že si budete rozumieť. A teraz už predávam slovo Kristien Ring.
Thank you. Thank you. Here we go. Right. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here and thank you all for coming tonight and for this great interest in the project Self-Made City. The idea of getting together and building something together and just making our place in the city has been something that I've been working on for quite a while, particularly as I was the director of the DOTS, and there was a time in Berlin when really nothing else was being built, and this seemed to be a phenomenon of what are architects doing. So that's how I kind of started on this subject. How do I go forward? Here. This way. So there we go. So asking the question, what do these kind of projects do for the city, and what are they, from the grassroots all the way up to building new, even new parts of the city? And when they come together, what benefits does the city have? Is it about just us creating our own little four walls, or is it about really the bigger picture, about making city? And asking the question, who makes the city? Whose city is it? Is it always just the investors that provide what's on the market, and we have to accept that? Or is it the people who live there, the people who actually use the city every day, that should really have much more of a part in deciding what happens there? And can it be more like our small-scale developments where a family creates their own home? They have everything under control. And looking at the city, at what happens there, we see so much of, this is karaoke in the Mauer Park. I'm sure probably many of you are familiar with it. One Irish guy came to the park, it was always empty, and he packed out his karaoke equipment, and now he has entirely transformed how this park is used. And really by offering this a different use for the space, looking at the potential of what we have in front of us within our cities, and just doing something, he's created really an entirely different landscape here. It looks like this now every weekend, more or less. And people who just look for holes, look for ways to create kind of their own world in the city. This is just planting along the street, and it was a cooperation between the citizens who lived there and the city who wanted to make it nicer, and somehow they found a way to come together and make it nicer and good, the way they wanted. So, and just the way this kind of idea spills over, and people just put their mark on the city and affect the way other people go about their day, saying, oh, wow, that's nice. So it's our city, and we can do something to make it our city and to make it better. For example, the urban gardening examples, not only the Prinzessinnengärten that take over unused spaces and make it into a temporary garden, a place that brings all walks of life, all different kinds of people together. And this is a concept that has been actually embraced in the city planning and transferred over as a strategy. The temporary use of spaces. Now, this is Tempelhof and what Raumlabor, the concept of Raumlabor at the very, in around 2008. Now, the first initial fair and initiation of these spaces, and how that will continue now is really kind of quite interesting, because the citizens in Berlin said that they didn't want to build anything there. So we're going to have a continuation of what the city thought was going to be temporary, and will now go into a much more go on for a much more extended period of time. But I think interesting about that point is that, I know we were just talking about this today, is that that this kind of temporary can really start to transform long-term, have a long-term effect on the city. So when I came to Berlin, there was lots of opportunity. The city looked like this, and lots was empty, and people started just doing things. And it was this, for example, this is Realities United. They cut open a hole in the roof of the place that they lived in and made it into a convertible. And people didn't want to move out of the city when they started to have families. So that was a lot of the motivation of these very first Baugruppen projects that you see presented in the next room, was simply out of, the motivation at first was really a lot of families getting together that didn't want to move out of the city, that didn't find anything on the market, and their motivation was to make places that were suitable for the kind of life that they were looking for, places in the city for families. Now that's changed entirely. Now that's it's really expanded to a lot of very diverse different kinds of people. But the very first projects were made by the people looking for something that they didn't find, and this was an installation at the Palast der Republik at the same time. Zweifel, doubt. Is the city actually going in the direction that we want? Or all of these big developments really the way we see our city? Or is it more that we want to create our own oasis, that we want to create our own space in the city? And at the time, of course, there were a lot of empty sites. And this is Florian Kröll with the Strelitzer Straße that you can see in the exhibition. Very enthusiastically, these, really at the same time, it was like a phenomenon, a movement that all of these architects got the same idea at the same time. There was no work in Berlin. The sites were quite inexpensive and cheap. and families or people were looking for something that wasn't on the market, getting together to form what they called the Baugruppe. Now, like I said at the beginning, it was a very kind of pragmatic solution. But this is, and when I did the very first exhibition about who's doing it, how is it built, how are the groups set up, what are the legal situations, how can you get a loan from the bank, we had to stress the fact that it was very pragmatic. It wasn't anything like the collectives of the 60s. And in the meantime, after 2008, society internationally has entirely changed. I think this is a really interesting point to say that since the whole kind of background of the Baugruppe has really is much more about what can we share, what can we do together that we can't do alone. So through this process, these hundreds of projects that now exist in Berlin, it's really, for all of them, still the bottom line is about creating better neighborhoods, creating affordability within the city, places that suit their needs, and very specialized needs, something that they normally wouldn't be able to find. And of course, creating spaces that can be adapted over time. So, and through redefining this kind of participatory format, all the groups are different and do it in a different ways, but they found a way to structure these projects so that they are realizable. And they've done it to a standard with such a high building standard, or an architectural standard, and such a low cost that has actually affected the market in Berlin also on its entirety. So now the developers of other projects have to build to a higher quality and to a lower price. So here are some, just a few. And my question with Self-Made City was then, how do all of these initiatives, be it in open space, common space, or even as a Baugruppe or an association, how do they come together in the city and actually do they create more benefit for the city than other projects? And why should the city maybe facilitate these kind of projects? So my goal was to really look at what are these factors that create more benefit for the city, and what do they do? So like you'll be able to see in the exhibition, we have a lot of custom, So the idea about custom made, how can we make, what is flexibility? Is it only about moving walls? How do we need to think about spaces that can be changeable over time, that can afford multi-generation, that can make special spaces for special solutions, special user groups? And one of the very first projects was the stacked villa idea. So for families that would normally move outside of the city, stacking the kind of single-family home one on top of each other, sharing the garden space, and sharing a space in the middle that at the moment they rent out, but it's intended that they can either, the entire building can share this space as a space for a nurse, or somebody's parents can move in there if they need care. So it's a space that's owned by the entire building and rented out. So that's how they've created flexibility for different economic situations or different life situations. That's the shared garden. And I have to say that this building was built, including the site, in 2008. It was finished, and the price was 1,700 euros per square meter, which translates to much less rent than you would pay anywhere in the area nowadays, or even back then. So Florian Köhl's building at the Strelitzerstraße, which you can see in the exhibition, I think is very important to, I won't show it in depth because you can see it there, but it's important to mention here in this context because he found a way to work very closely with his clients. And it wasn't only about choice, it was also about redefining the role of the architect. How can you see yourself as the architect coming up with the real vision in the end, but then working so closely that it's really a collaboration, kind of like the shared authorship, he calls it. And really here devising this very elaborate bathroom, but also for the group for a very simple problem. They weren't allowed to build balconies. The city planning said no balconies, so they came up with these fold-out doors, which was a real inspiration to other groups at the same time, because they noticed that they could go the extra step. They could say, wait a minute, you can't just say, no, we're going to do it anyway, like this. So, and when these, like I said, when these groups came together, they really started to think about, well, if we're doing something together anyway, what can we share? I mean, if we share, we're not just 1 + 1 + 1, we're 1 + 1 is 10. So what are those spaces? And this is also an idea that really mushroomed. At the very beginning, it was very pragmatic, and then people started sharing rooftop terraces and guest rooms, and but also very pragmatic spaces. Like here, this is just an area that is wonderful for the kids to run around in all year long, and it might. And off of here is like a bathroom and a kitchen, and it spills out onto this garden space. And it's really quite simple, but it's so used. They use it all. Every one of them uses it every day. I mean, there's not only shared storage spaces so that all the kids can use all of the bicycles, whatever's, or these like bobby cars and things like the ones that they grow out of after 1 year. They're just shared. You don't even have to pass them on. They're just, everybody uses them. So, and the kitchen and it's very compact and very rational. And on the other hand, others share like a swimming pool. So they've made which one is it? This one. They're really their own oases. And all of the projects in Berlin share their garden space, which is interesting in a situation like this, because this is big yard, because then you start to see what the community life can be. But when you start to think about if we pay for things privately but open that up to the public, then I think it's quite interesting. This is the project also by Zanderroth architects, same architects, that in making a pocket park, of course, we're able to get better light into the buildings surrounding them, but really it set a precedent. It set a precedent in this privately paid, completely public, there are no fences, completely public park. And they promised the city that they would take care of it for the next 100 years. So this has inspired actually quite a lot of other projects to look at the way they address the issue of public and private. And many, even much larger projects are now thinking about how do they address that issue of fence, how do they make it open and inclusive for the neighborhood. And I think when the people come together, this is my hypothesis, when the people come together and think about what can they share and what can they do together, and they're willing, they're going to live there for the rest of, for the next foreseeable time and eternity for them. They're really interested in their neighborhood and activating this neighborhood, making it a good neighborhood. And so in this way, I think are really willing to be good neighbors. So that, of course, is an aspect that really adds to the quality of life in the city. And that's why the city started to think about how can, and this is the Ritterstrasse, which you can also see in the exhibition, how can we actually facilitate these projects? And with the Ritterstrasse, they did it in a way that they offered land to a fixed price, because the problem is, as soon as the market is anywhere normal and heated, a developer is much more quick in buying a site than a group. A group has to get the money together, they have to agree, they have to go to the bank, they all have to get separate loans, and they have to have a design and an idea. So it's really quite a long process. Is that mine? Super. And the city started to facilitate these projects by simply saying the land will be a fixed price and you have 6 months to put together a concept. And they decided to pick the concept that would offer the most architecturally and in terms of benefits for the neighborhood. So the project that you see in the next room, Ritterstraße 1, they were able to build this. And what happened in this project, I think, is quite interesting because they promised. So I won't go through every detail that you can see, but I would like to say that it was not only the process of decision making, it was also the process of making a matrix of different building materials that people could decide from. But it was also thinking about what do we share and how do we share it with each other, and how do we share this space with the neighborhood. So, I mean, this is, these are the shared balconies, the spaces that go around. This is the very large shared space at the bottom floor. And I would like to go back to the very first picture. Here you can see a very difficult inner city situation with a modernist housing development. And it's very tricky to densify within those kind of structures that we have in all of our European cities after war kind of developments. So they have a very unique way, I think, of opening up the ground floor space, the garden space. It's completely open. There are also no fences. So they offer that space to the neighborhood, and they do it in a way that I think is very natural, but still densifies this area in quite a good way. And they also offer. Oops, is that the wrong way? It is. They also offer this shared ground floor space to the neighborhood. Other people can rent it out and use it as an event space. So in that way, they really come into contact with the neighbors. And these are some of the elements that each person could decide from. The facade was changeable. And that's the ground floor space. That is their big shared space. So the other question that was really important with this project was how much to ask the question of how much space people actually need. The very first Baugruppen projects, they saved a lot of money, so they put it into making their flats huge, basically. You have this whole kind of 240 square meter flats and 3 stories and a lot of luxury. And this project really asks the question, well, do we need all that? And if we share all this space, they have a roof terrace as well. If we share all of this space, can't we make our own flats smaller? We can have the party downstairs. We don't need to have this like living room that can accommodate that. We just need, other things. So, indeed, this project I think has an average of like 90 square meter flats for 4 persons, which is much smaller than the others. So they've reversed the trend, I think, and have asked many questions about how we want to live in the future and what affordable housing could be. And also in addressing the issue of flexibility over time, what do we do for the city? I think this project is key. The Bar Architekten Oderberger Straße project that you can also see in the exhibition is key in the way that it actually gives something back to the city. It was their goal to develop a building that was a mix, like the essential mix of urbanity in the city. That we have housing, that we have a mix, that we can a mix of different kinds of flats, that they're changeable over time, that there are shared spaces. They have a shared apartment, a guest apartment and roof terrace, and that the rest of the other half of the building it can be used in many different ways. It can also accommodate like different economic changes within the city. That when an area of the city maybe nobody wants to work there anymore. You never know how the demographics in a city are going to change. You can use particularly these middle spaces in entirely different ways. And the these are some of the flats. I'll just go through quickly because you can see them in the exhibition. And these are the short stay apartments, or they can be used just as well as a working space, an atelier. And this is the ground floor that has not only a shop but a cafe and also an art space. So I think it's a project that's very much about what is the city and what do we need. And in the same way, the Flottwellstrasse was very key. This maybe you can this project is presented, but this is maybe not an aspect that you might see because what was essential about this project is that it's in an area of development where it was the first project. It was by far the first project. The other projects are just getting finished now, and the project is now, I think, 3 or 4 years old. And what they did, it took a huge effort for them to develop the ground floor space. How do you develop a ground floor space when there's nobody there to rent it? But you know that what you do here is going to set a precedent for everything else that gets built. If you have an area that, like, this is it was a bad area of the city, you could probably not even, you won't know anymore. But when you're starting to do a building and financing it, you always have to find the right mix of use to activate the city. And I think that was key in this project. And it's something that, about the issue of the people who develop a project are going to be using it and living there over time are going to make entirely different decisions than people who develop it speculatively. They'll find a way to make these places work. Just as when you have amazing historical buildings, old buildings, the people who love those buildings are going to find a way to make them work. And so we can use groups like this who have a special interest in this building to actually activate them. And so these are just a couple examples that I keep forgetting which one it is. It's this one. Okay. No, wrong. This one. So these groups have, these are just a couple examples where people have come together because that was a beautiful building and they wanted to live there and they found a way to make it happen. So I think what the last really important point is that that these groups are investing in the future because they're going to live there themselves. They're investing in passive building technologies, particularly ecological and even sometimes experimental technologies with several story wooden constructions. Now there are 2 different types in Berlin. Both of them were tested, tried, and researched by Baugruppe. And also experimental ideas. This is the other, the Esmarstraße is shown in the exhibition, and this is the other project that is completely out of wooden construction. And this is a building by Arno Brandelhübber, also a project that asks us, well, how do we really need to see architecture in the city? Shouldn't it be something that's transformable? He used an old leftover building site. There was only the garage that was built, and it stood empty for years, and it was not foreseeable that this area of the city was going to develop quickly. So, but you can't tell anymore, but at the time it was. So he wanted to come up with an idea that was where the facade could be changed, where the spaces could be used in entirely different ways. And so it's these kind of ideas for the future that we need to be able to. We need to have the kind of people that will test these ideas, that will give these ideas space. Just as the big yard townhouses by Zanderroth architects that have found a completely different kind of typology for the inner city. So, like I was saying, the people who are going to live there over a long period of time make entirely different decisions based on an entirely different set of rules. And the central problem and the central point about getting these projects to work is to make sure that the groups can get together in order to buy the site quickly enough. And in terms of developing the city, if we have a site and we can divide the site into smaller parcels, this sounds very simple, but it's the smaller the parcels are, the easier the groups can get together. Just a very small 10-person or 8 family or 10 family or party building is much easier and much more manageable than one for 20. So if we, just by dividing the sites, we can make these things more possible. And the city can facilitate, like as in the Ritterstraße, by putting an option on the site. It doesn't even have to be more cheap. They don't even have to support it in terms of money. It just has to be that the groups are enabled through the time factor, that they have the time to come together to get the money to the table. Of course, and the city, not only do they get all of these benefits back socially and economically for the city, but they can also say that if we're going to provide land, we can do it based on the concept. No, it doesn't actually have to be the city that can say this. We can also, the more we get people talking about projects like this, the more we can actually try to convince private landowners just to simply think about who they sell their land to. It's really a kind of a zero-liner. They can really just simply look at what's going to happen with the land in the end. And in that way, I mean, we can really think about how our cities are programmed, what happens there, and how these things come together. This is a project that is an example, the Ex-Roterprint, is an example of how we can use the land in an entirely different way to make a different financial structure. They found a foundation to buy the land, and now they, they could have very easily sold off every bit of this project. They could have divided it up and sold it off to everybody that was already working there. They all would have been able to buy it. But they said that the interests wouldn't come together right, and they wanted to have it super low rent. They wanted to be able to include different kinds of social groups, and so in order to be able to do that, they found a foundation to buy the land, and now they rented from them, and now they can hold the rents really low and fulfill their ideologies. And following along with that, the project Spreefeld, where the bar architects and Florian Crew that are exhibited next door worked on this project along with Silvia Capernetto, and the mastermind behind the project was die Zusammenarbeiter. And the idea here was, this is a project right along the Spree River, that they again also decided that it wasn't about ownership, that they wanted to do much more in terms of creating diversity, creating different age groups, because what happens actually when these projects go from one generation to the next, they wanted to make sure that there were young people and old people and every whole mix living here. They wanted to create a financial structure that could cross-finance, and they could say, okay, well, the people living in the penthouses should pay more so that we can create really cheap flats in the first floor that enable a real diverse kind of mix of people to live here. So they created an association. So people actually buy shares in the association. And, well, first of all, they rent the land. So that brought the entire price of the project down in the beginning, the initial financial commitment. And then they created the association, so people actually buy shares, and they do that in a way that it's, like I said, cross-financed, that there are some places that are more expensive, some that are less expensive. So they share a lot of spaces. There are actually cluster cluster living, what they call cluster living, where groups of people actually share lots of shared space, like an entire living room and kitchen. They cook together, and then there are like private bedrooms. And that's like 2 floors of one of these 3 buildings. They have like 4 different cluster communities within this. This is one cluster where you can see this is their shared living room, dining room, and kitchen, and these are their private spaces. So there are like 4 or 6, no, in this one there are 6 families living together. Yeah, and across the street on the Spree River, just across, well, not across the street, across the river from that project is a project that is still in the planning, but it was also, the land was given or put up for offer at a fixed price, and it was given based on the concept of what was going to happen there. And it was awarded to the Holzmarkt, which is also an association. It was the same people who started a bar there many years ago. So they had the bar called Bar 25, Bar 25, and a restaurant, and then they got kicked, and it was wonderful, it was great, it was legendary. Then they got kicked off, they went across the river and built out a big factory in old ruin and made that into a legendary nightclub. And so they kept getting pushed off the land, making something even better. And now, as soon as they were going to get pushed out of this amazing ruin where they were able to buy this land. So it's going to be really quite amazing what they're doing here. This is part of it. This is the part that's going to always change and always be different, and every day somebody's going to move around. And there's another part of the project that is, of course, the entire walkway along the river is completely public, and there's going to be a way to go over, and everybody's going to grow things on the roofs, and whatever they grow, they're going to use in the restaurant. And then this part of the project over here is going to be taller buildings that kind of cross-finance all of this over here. So we'll see what happens. I hope the next time when you come, oh, wrong way. I hope the next time when you come to Berlin that you see that project and this project. And this is also, again, by Realities United, where their vision, a totally self-initiated vision of turning the canal along our museums island into a swimmable river. It's not used for the ship transportation anymore. They did a study, and they did all of this on their own. And finally, they've won many awards for it now, and now the city's backing it. So I think that's a good way to think about what we can do for our cities and how we want to live, and that if we have these kind of ideas, what we can do for our city and how they should be, that it really is possible. They went through so many years of not having any interest from the city, and now finally. So yeah, that's it. Thanks.
I think it's very nice that that you shared your knowledge from your projects with us. I can give you now the space for our audience to, if you have some questions. Yes.
Hello. I would just like to ask, how did the people come together? Do they have something like online platform, or do they usually know each other? Or
there are many different ways, really, but both of those. I think many of the first projects were started and initiated because the people already knew lots of other people that were looking for the same thing. But of course, that's been professionalized. There's a platform there are several platforms, and I think they're all listed in your brochures, in the back of the brochures.
In our Baugruppe manual.
Exactly. I saw. So. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for this. And I wanted to maybe come back to a few ideas, because you said like first it started as maybe like private initiatives of few groups coming together to have some space. And later on you mentioned something really important, like it started to influence the market. And you said like it started to influence developers to improve the quality of their own developments. So my question would be, how many of these Baugruppen or maybe of these projects are in Berlin? How big percentage? Is it if we just compare it with usual developments, or how many city land is actually blocked by this Baugruppen?
Yeah, those are a lot of questions, but let's see. The development changed because in between 2002 and 2008, or 2007, there was hardly anything else being developed. So all of these projects came together and were then a huge amount, or they consisted of basically a huge amount or percentage of what was being built at the time. If you look at that today, there are maybe just as many projects being developed, but of course they make up a much lower percentage of what is being built. I would say, to take the middle ground, that there are only about 10% at the maximum Baugruppen houses being built in this format. That's simply because I think the interest is much, much higher, and that there's simply not enough ability to acquire land. That's the problem now. The problem now is that the market is too heated, and it's too expensive, and it's difficult to get land quickly enough. Sorry.
Everything is beginning at the buying of the plot or finding the plot.
Yeah.
There's a question. And today, the Berlin have a very big crisis, dwelling crisis. A lot of people want to live there, and I think the city is starting again building the flats. I think
exactly. That's the kind of the problem for Baugruppen, is that politically, this is maybe to Berlin, but perhaps there are some key ties to Prague. Now the private-public kind of housing associations are now getting the sites from the city, or have their own sites, and are building quite a lot of flats. So in that way, there's going to be more on the market in terms of low-cost housing. Luxury housing is already on the market and continues to be so.
I would have one question now. In your presentation, it was very nice showing that the model was kind of evolving, and you said also that it started kind of very pragmatic way, where people wanted maybe just to get very cheap dwelling or flat, and then it started to evolving, that people started to take care more about their location, about their street. And now, what's the next step? So, how do you see it? So, people came from the very pragmatic way to some care about the city. What will be next? Or
I think the last two projects that I showed are indicative of where the thinking is going. They're incredibly experimental about how do we create diversity, and not only a mix of age groups, but a mix of different walks of life, different income groups, different types of people. And that's maybe very much Spreefeld, this Spreefeld project, the one that's finished. And the last project that I showed, they're really about, they have an entirely kind of new way of thinking about the financing model. It's too much to explain, but it's really cross-financing to the max, let's just say. How do we make it possible for things to change constantly all the time, to always be startup? How? I mean, it's the why I explained where they come from, because it's for them really important. They say that like all of the creativity and ingenuity in what happens is caused or born out of the necessity to always adapt. And so if that is always adapting, they will always be the hotspot for new ideas. So, yeah.
Yeah, the guys from Holtzmarkt were here last year at the Recite conference, so some of us maybe know this project already. Yeah. Do we have some more questions? You told me that you are also working in the Stockholm, or is it Stockholm? Helsinki, sorry. And Baugruppe has also very strong position also in the north of the Europe, Denmark, Finland, Sweden. Is it something, because we also on the exhibition and also in your presentation we saw just Berlin, but the Baugruppe they are more spread also in German-speaking countries and also in the northern. Do you see some big difference, maybe in the motivation of the people or the ideas why the people join these projects? Does it a little bit differ between maybe German-speaking countries and the Northern Europe?
Yeah, that's interesting. For example,
or maybe England.
Yeah, actually, England and Denmark have similarities. They have a long, particularly Denmark has a very long tradition. And their co-housing is really about the community. The community has always been, it's never been kind of this pragmatic solution that the Baugruppe involves. It's always been about most of the co-housing situations also in the United States, they have like an eating, they cook together all the time. Some of them have very small private kitchens. But the whole thing is about that they come together, they have a meal together every evening, and they really share a lot of other kind of social services, like what happens with the kids, and the kids all play together in a big area, and I mean that's kind of the ideology behind there, and so that's interesting to see the Baugruppen in Germany transforming in that way, but that was always the underlying principle in these other countries to compensate for what they were missing in society.
Mm. Yeah, I believe that also when Baugruppe would exist in Czech Republic, it have to find its own way or mutation, or because the motivation of the people differs also to the to the market situation and also the real estate situation and so on.
I would like to go back to Berlin. Also, in your short text from your presentation, there was this statement that the main characteristics of Berlin is to be something unfinished, something in transformation. It's a city of pioneers. The space gets transformed and so on. Do you see this characteristic still in Berlin, or is it changing under the market conditions? Or, what are the projects that keep this unfinishedness of Berlin?
Yeah, I think no city is ever finished, but and I think that's the important part about a city, is that it's always adapting, and that we build spaces that can be adaptable and in many ways. But I think that's exactly what I was talking about the Holtzmarkt, the last project for, because this. I think in some ways people do think, if you've been to Berlin in the 90s, if you've been to Berlin 10 years ago, you'll say, oh, it's so, at the moment it looks much more finished than it did. But in a way, there's on the one hand a wish to kind of reinstate that, and that being this sort of always changing, being quite in the foreground of these creative possibilities, like in the Holtzmarkt.
Sorry, it seems like a female debate except of Vlado. But maybe I'm coming back to what you said, and I didn't want to make some negative point about Baugruppe. I just come back to exhibition opening, and there was someone from city of Berlin who said, like, we are supporting this policy for Baugruppe, and maybe I would like to ask, like, how? How do they support it, except of, like, selling land and then having 6 months for coming with the best concept? And actually maybe coming into wider discussion, most of problems start when city sells the land. And there are examples like Vienna, who never sells the land, so it always rent for 100 years. So how much of the land city really owns in Berlin, and how do they sell it, rent it, whatever? What they do with this?
That's a really good question. It's a whole, let's see if I can, in 3 sentences, answer the politics of Berlin land owning. It's a little bit too complex.
About this thing.
Yeah, exactly. There are lots of conferences. Exactly. But maybe your point is exactly right. To ask the question, do we need to sell the land? Should we not, just like we have to ask the question, is privatization of our utilities the solution as a city? We have to ask also the question, should we sell the city land? Why not use a land lease? Kind of, this is something that I thank you for asking, because I like sometimes, that's the other option, is that you can really reduce the initial investment of a project, making it more affordable by using a land lease kind of a situation. You rent the land and have the right to build and live there for the next 100 years. And I think that is a great possibility for the city to put stipulations on what is done there, and at the same time keep not only control but the financial advantage for the next generations. So I think that's a really important factor. I think how Berlin does it and if it works and stuff is maybe, I mean, they're not too, the couple projects that actually happened are shown here. It's kind of a wishful thinking, because like I said, the politics at the moment are more going towards mass housing.
I have maybe one more very complicated question. Veřejná from Beckert, she was here on the opening, and she told for me very interesting idea that for her is Baugruppe kind of experiment, the space for experiment in the typology of how should living and the flats look today. It's for her something what the place for play, let's say, but she's developing this kind of new typologies. Can be, or is the Baugruppe the inspiration, for example, also for the developers? How do they take something from them or some inspiration and develop their own projects? Does it happen somewhere? Or?
Yeah, in many levels. Let's talk about like the floor to ceiling height. If you don't intervene, they'll build 2.60 meters. And if you don't have enough examples of people wanting real ceiling heights, they'll continue to do that. But if you want to offer luxury living, which they all do, then you have to take on some of the really important standards that for example, have been done by the Baugruppe. And that has happened not only with that, but also with, for example, open kitchens. Nobody ever, like, they just wouldn't do it. Nobody would ever build the American open kitchen living room kind of situation, dining open. And now that's what they build, because, you know, looking at the Baugruppe houses, like, they all have that. What else? Yeah, ecological building standards, I think, as well. They have a look at.
And for example, the community spaces, because I think now developer can offer something which is for the community. I think maybe a roof terrace, but
that's funny that you mentioned. This is starting. I've seen this starting, not particularly in Berlin, but in other countries, becoming really popular. Yeah, particularly for luxury apartments are now having lots of community spaces. I don't know. But they're also all doing urban gardening and rooftop gardening. We'll see this year.
Yeah, I would like to see this community gardening after a few years, if it's still working or...
If anything's still alive. Yeah, I think that's something really special. Yeah.
All right. Do we have some more questions? Okay, thank you very much. Also thank you, Kristien, that you came here. And thank you that you came also here because there are another events in the Prague, so we are glad that we we have you here. I think the exhibition will be maybe opened till 8 o'clock, 1 hour, so maybe you can go there and check it if you haven't seen it. And also we have a Baugruppe manual. It's kind of small book where we tried to describe how can it work here, what are the advantages and also disadvantages, how much could it cost, and so on. So you can take it and of course see the exhibition. Okay, thank you very much and have a nice evening.